Okay, we're on Nun Ches Amud Aleph. So we're going to continue our discussion of the Mishnah. We're getting close to the final pieces of the Mishnah, which of course is deals with the exemptions to Onah by Hegdish and Karka and Shtoris and Avadim. And our focus is on Hegdish because there are all kinds of different Mishnahs and Brises which seem to they interact and they contradict our Mishnah. So we have to find sort of refuge in trying to conciliate the Mishnah with the Brises. And so what we do, of course, is we find a little bit of a hitch that suggests that it's not, on par. Therefore, there's no stira, because in the Mishnah you could say one thing, and if it's slightly different, you could say something else. And that's again the modus operandi in the Gemara, is how we try to reconcile most of the contradictions. And when we come up against something that we can't reconcile, then in those few instances we have teku, because we couldn't even come up with a source or a chiddush to say that there's a difference between this and that. So that's generally how, when you look at a piece of Gemara, you see very often that what happens to be open contradictions can be sort of put together, responded by a slight nuance in the language, and we're going to see that again now when we go forward. We see again those now. We ended last week because we had the kasha about a stira in the Mishnahs. And if you remember, so we said, and this is about the middle of the page, Elo Amar Rabbi Elazar, the very end of last week. So Rabbi Elazar wants to reconcile the two Mishnahs, and he says, Shvu zu takonis chachamim hi. So he came up with a different theory, that you're really right, that when you say you have to make a shvua, the Mishnah says you don't make a shvua. And so that, right on its face, it seems to be a contradiction. So Rabbi Elazar came up with a chiddush. He said, "You're right. We normally don't make a shvua, but here it's a takanos chachamim shlo yibnei adam zalzlim megdeshus." So the theory is that a person shouldn't treat hegdish very lightly. So we slap on a shvua. This way, it'll make him think twice and three times before he does something with regard to hegdish, because hegdish means going against the Rabbanu Shalom. So, okay, it's one thing if you and I have a dispute and you say, I swear, and we believe you because a shvua is a heavy-duty thing, okay? But by hegdish, we say generally we don't swear. Says Rabbi Elazar, why in that case we swore? Because of takanos chachamim. So that's the kind of reconciliation that we try to find, even if it's only one man diamer. It's Rabbi Elazar, it was a Tana. I mean, not everybody had to agree with him, but we take his thoughts into consideration, especially now that we see, if there's a stira, so we say, okay, Rabbi Elazar has a good theory. All right, so that's how we ended last week. Now, so we talked about Shomer Chinam, we talked about Shomer Sachar, both of whom the Mishnah says are exempt, yet we see that there are shvuas. And of course, we said they're different shvuas. It's not the shvuas of liability, it's the shvua of getting paid. So he has to make a shvua in order to get paid. So that's already a different shvua. So that's not contradictory to our Gemara. Now, so now we're about the middle of the page. We start with the end of the two dots there. Noisa sochar ein mishalim. The Mishnah says that a noisa sochar does not have to pay, even though he gets paid, but there's no liability. So frek the Gemara azay. Ramalei Rabbi Yosef bar Chama Rabba. Rabbi Yosef bar Chama asked a question of Rabba with regard to this noisa sochar. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, noisa sochar ein mishalim, that a noisa sochar doesn't pay. He's exempt in the case of hegdish. Raminu. So I'll ask you a kasha. We see that that's not the case from another source. If the gizbar of hegdish hires a worker, okay. Now listen to this. Lishmor sapara. So one of the functions of the Beis Hamikdash was to purify people through the paraduma. The paraduma, it's been in the news in the last couple of years because they think they have one, and it's a whole to do. But at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there were paradumas, but they had to be meticulously people had to be meticulously careful on how they treated the paraduma. So the gizbar hires a worker, someone, an expertise, to watch over this paraduma that inadvertently it shouldn't become puzzle. For instance, it's not a beast of burden. You can't saddle it. You have to treat it a certain way. So the slightest nuance could passel the paraduma, and they needed it for the Beis Hamikdash. So he hires a worker for the paraduma, or lishmar satinik. There's within the procession of the paraduma, you have a child who has to bring the water, has to bring it to the kohen. He has a role, but that child also has to be carefully guarded. That he shouldn't become tamei. Because remember, in the whole chain of events, if someone becomes tamei, it can carry the tumah all the way down. So this child has to be sequestered so that he shouldn't become tamei while he's doing his work for the paraduma, and you have to have a shomer for that, or lishmas hazaroim. They had a shomer who guarded the barley, the first barley for the omer and for the shtei lechem. So you had to make sure that again that there was no contamination or anything, but B, people would take that for themselves, people going along the way, and especially in Shemitah years, which we talked about, where everything is fallow, but you still have growths from the previous year that are considered, again, there's a little bit of discussion, but are considered not to be Shemitah. And so how do you make the omer for the following year when there's no growth? And so this aftergrowth from the previous year is carefully guarded. So you have to have a shomer for that, because everybody's going to say, "Oh, where am I going to get this? Where am I going to get any food or barley?" And they're going to go to the field. So you have to have a shomer for that. Anyway, the point is that the gizbar hires individuals to be shomrim for the Beis Hamikdash. So here we see a situation where someone, the gizbar isn't hiring it for himself. So it's definitely not his own, right? Like we saw in the previous Gemara, he's hiring on behalf of the Beis Hamikdash. All right, so that's the facts. Says that brisa, in those kinds of circumstances, when you have a shomer, ein noisen lo schar Shabbos. So we all know that you can't work on Shabbos, and therefore you can't get schar, you can't get paid. So here you have a workman who doesn't take off Shabbos because he's a shomer. So he's a shomer not 6 but 7 days a week. It's a holy shomer, so he's not considered avoda. But you can't pay him. You cannot pay him for Shabbos, right? So what's the upshot? Lefichach ein achrei Shabbos alav. Therefore, if something happens on Shabbos, even though he's guarding, because he didn't give up the guarding, it's just he doesn't get paid. Ein achrei Shabbos alav, he is not mechuyev, because because it's Shabbos. Right? So Shabbos does not give him any chiyuv. Now, Shiur Shabbos, this is how today, and of course, al halacha, how do we deal with that? I mean, we all have jobs, and the jobs sometimes, I mean, not that you have to work on Shabbos, but technically you may be getting paid for Shabbos 7 days a week. So the Gemara says, the Brisa says, Shiur Shabbos, Shiur Chodesh, Shiur Shana, if a person negotiated a weekly salary, a monthly salary, a yearly salary, Shiur Shavua. So if that's the case, Noisen lo schar Shabbos, you're allowed to pay him for Shabbos. I mean, after all, he's doing the Shmira. It's not as if he's not doing it, but if he's there for let's say a month before the Kohen has to do his thing, then he gets paid for the month. Shabbos is in the month, but he's not getting paid exactly for Shabbos. So we see these kinds of exemptions that we learn from the Torah. That in that particular case, says Chazal, you can get paid. Lefika chachrei Shabbos alav. Therefore, the achrei Shabbos is on him. So what is that brisa telling us? That when the Gizbar hires someone to work on behalf of the Beis Hamikdash, there can be a Chiyuv Shabbos. He's just enumerating how it's done because you can't do it as a day worker, but you have to do it as a the Shabbos being part of a greater whole, whether it's a week, a month, more, doesn't matter. But you're not isolating the Shabbos and paying him specifically for Shabbos. You're paying him for the whole thing. Okay, so that's what that brisa says.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is this the basis why today, if you hire a contractor to do something in your yard, you're hiring him for the job, not for the specific days? If he decides to do some labor at home, on Shabbos, that's not a problem for us because we hired for the job. Is this the source for that whole thinking on the way we live today?
Yeah, absolutely. In other words, what we're seeing from this Gemara, which is halacha, you're right, it's really halacha lemaisa, is that when you turn over a job to a contractor and you're not in control of the job, then you don't dictate to him what to do. I mean, he works on Shabbos, not on Sunday, whatever. He has a job. The job has to be finished in 6 months, and he works. Of course, he has to be a goy. You hire another Jew. But that's precisely the point, is that you're not dictating to him, so it's out of your control whether he works on Shabbos or not. And that is the source of it, because
So the
again,
benefit,
the Chazal were very practical too, because in Masa and Matan they realized that if we were going to be super meticulous about everything that we do, it might be very difficult to be able to. I mean, the Torah didn't mean to punish us by saying it. Oh, you can't work on Shabbos, therefore you can't have a project, because the project has to go on. Sometimes it needs to be. There has to be some work done on a Shabbos. So exactly right. So this is that source where if it becomes part of a greater whole, especially you can't dictate. If you dictate, it's one thing. But when you turn it over to a contractor, you put it in his hands. So he has to decide when and where and how to do it. But that's exactly right.
Yeah, but
That's
what
the source.
about on an individual basis? In other words, I'm a contractor. I have to finish a job by such and such a day. All my employees are goyim. Can they work? I mean, they're theoretically they're being supervised by me because I've gotten the job, but they're like they know what they have to do. It's not where I have to show them you have to do this, you have to do that. They know what they're doing, so they go out and do it. So in that respect, is it the same thing?
All right. So this is an interesting question. So you're the contractor
Right?
and you have non-Jewish employees.
Yes.
And so you're directing them to do a job. You're not telling them to work on Shabbos.
Right.
You're saying we have to finish this by December 31st. Go
Right.
do it.
Yeah.
So in that case, but again, you have to be careful, because if you are involved in the ongoing sort of process, then you have to be very careful, because it may come out that you're dictating for them to work on Shabbos. So you really have to give them broad space, and in fact say to them that your responsibility is to get this job done. I'm not telling you how and when and where, but you'll have to report to me, every week or every 3 weeks or whatever. Just give me your progress. I think you can do that, but you have to be careful on how you do it, so that shouldn't seem, like you said before, that you're dictating and therefore they have to work on Shabbos. Maybe they can work a double shift Friday if that's what they want to do. They're going away for the weekend. So you can't dictate that, but you have to be careful that in what you're telling them to do, that you're not specifically telling them that they have to work on Shabbos. So if someone is a weekly or a monthly worker and it's got to get done, it's got to get done. It's got to get done. So I think, yes, the answer is we can do that, but again, very carefully on how you give the instructions so that it shouldn't appear that you're specifically asking them to work on Shabbos.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
I'm a, I'm the example cited in the Gemara and also brings me to a practice that used to happen, but the idea is that um, you're hiring someone to do something in the Beis Hamikdash. If you know, so you have someone who is in the olden days, at least in my show, they used to pay a Balkora to come
right.
and lay in every Shabbos.
Yeah, they still do in
And,
many
and in
places.
some shows, I'm sure they do, but most are volunteers. So you frame the contract that you're paying them annually to do this, but the
Correct.
actual performance is on Shabbos. So of the job. So if somebody doesn't show up, or how do you get around because the specific performance is either on Shabbos or Yontif that you're asking them to do the work? So you're exonerating them in the Beis Hamikdash because you're saying you can't pay them, but when you hire the child who is a shomer and you have to watch the child who's a shomer, it's for that particular day, which may be on Yontif, even though you can frame the contract as for the whole period to keep them away from Tuma, to keep them tahar. I'm trying to. Aren't we dancing around the head of a pin here a little bit?
Well, in a sense, you may be right, except that the way you frame it is of critical importance. I mean, that is part of the whole process, is how you frame it. So that if you frame it in a way that it doesn't violate, let's say, Hilchos Shabbos, where you directed someone to work for you for Shabbos, which is like you're working on Shabbos, then the again, we're balancing this against a larger value, which we've talked about numerous times in the Gemara, is that the Chazal understood that in commerce you have to have a little bit of a latitude, not chas v'shalom be over a lav, but you have to have a latitude as to what people can do. Otherwise, with regard to lending and all these other things that we talked about, so there has to be an understanding on how commerce can move forward. So when we have that situation and a work needs to be done, it just so happens to be that some of the work will be on a Shabbos or a Yontif for which you are not allowed to work. But they framed it in such a way that if you are not a poyel yoim, if you are not a day worker, where every day you get paid, if you don't show up, you don't get paid, then that's a problem. But if you have a contract, now I understand with the laning, although with the laning, that's not really avodah. In other words, you're giving someone compensation for like a gabbai or shamus or whatever to assist. So
So is that paying for the preparation, Rabbi, and
yeah.
deemed that the actual quote unquote avoda is free and clear, but you're paying for someone to prepare for Shabbos?
You could certainly consider that. But how about if you pay him for 52 weeks a year, or you pay him for more with Yontif and everything, and then he misses a week or two. So how are you going to treat that? Are you going to say, well, we get a contract, and sometimes in a contract you can't perform everything, so we're going to have an agreement that if you don't perform, we'll take off a little bit, we'll do something, but like everything else, there has to be performance on the contract. So as long as there's performance, even if there's a situation where if he doesn't come up a week, and as you make it seem as if you're paying him just for the week, but you're right, there's a lot that goes into it to get to Shabbos. So I think in that circumstance, we wouldn't be too concerned about paying him because it's part of the whole mass. If it's part of the whole mass, then you can deal with the individual problems. Oh, he couldn't come to Shabbos, or whatever the case may be. As long as we look at it in a broad scope and say it's you're not working on Shabbos because I'm hiring you to work on Shabbos. You're working as a whole And you're right. It does require a little bit of a tug because you're going to say, well, technically you're right, but he's working Shabbos. He said, but I'm not hiring him for Shabbos, and that's the loophole that Chazal gave us. If you're not hiring him just for Shabbos, you have latitude. Otherwise, in the greater scope of things, how will we move forward? How will anything get done? If so sometimes it may seem like it's sleight of hand, especially when we talk about the chametz b'Pesach and other things, but there's method behind that madness. So there's, in other words, you do something, but there's a method for how the Chazal interpreted it, and if people want to challenge it, but that's really what it's about. Anyway, so that's the setting. So that's that brisa that makes a chiluk between schar yoim and schar weekly, chodesh, whatever, shana. Okay. So now, okay, that's the brisa. Now, says the Gemara, my lav l'shalem. So now there's going to be a loss. Okay, in other words, the Shemer got Tameh, the Tina got Tameh. So in other words, now we have a problem, right? So if there is a loss, then there would be payment for that loss, right? In other words, you don't say, oh, it's a loss, we'll cancel it out. So there has to be my lav l'shalem, that you're going to have to pay for that loss if in this situation that the Brisa just told us, there was a breakdown, and one of the someone got tameh, right? So that's a loss because then it made, let's say, it made the paraduma tameh as an example, right? So then again, we have the problem with our Mishnah because a noisa socher, of which this person is, never is responsible for loss, right? Or Geneva, or whatever happened to be Aveda. So if that's the case, then that Mishnah, that Brisa, seems to, again, and this is what we've been talking about for the last few weeks, contradict the general principle of the Mishnah that a Shomer Sachar does not bear the loss of Hagdish. Because from this Mishnah, we see that if there is a problem, you have to pay for it. If you have to pay for it, when it says Achrayis Shabbos alav, he has an Achrayis on Shabbos. And if something happens, he's responsible. Yet our Mishnah says he's not. So this is a very, at least on its face, a very clear problem because we see that that it's contradictory to the Mishnah. So, and says the Gemara, no, that the similar answer to what we gave above. Again, it's another way of looking at the kasha. Lo lahafsitz charo, that it's not about liability, that he's liable for the loss, let's say, of the paraduma, which could be thousands of dollars or whatever it happens to be. It's lahefsitz charo, that you don't pay him for the schar, right? So he's not chayiv for the actual underlying. He's not liable for the actual underlying problem, but he loses his wage. Now, in the case of someone who is a day worker, I should say no, he's a worker for a period of time. So his work on Shabbos is part of the whole, but it makes him responsible as opposed to someone who's a day worker and doesn't get paid for Shabbos. So someone who gets paid for Shabbos because it's part of a larger contract is chayiv when there's he loses his wage for that particular time. So now the question is going to be, how do you evaluate that? Because Michael, to your point, if a person works on a yearly basis, okay, he gets a salary, $50,000 a year. So are we going to take 50,000 divided by 365 and say that that number is what he was getting paid for that day, and he loses his schar for that day? Because how else are we going to determine when you say he loses his schar, his wage? What's the wage? I mean, we're going to say every day is equal, 7 days a week, right? 12 months, 365 days. So you dock him, whatever that, I don't know what it comes out to, but whatever it comes out to based on his salary, that's what he has to take a loss. That's how we want to answer the stira, that he's not paying for liability, he's paying for lost wage. And we've already established that a shomer has to swear to get his money, right? That was a shvua that was added on, that not only, I mean, you swear for liability, but in order to get your schar, says the Gemara, you have to make a shvua. So, okay, so we've now reconciled again the Mishnah and the Brisa, that it's not a stira, that we can find a way to say that under certain circumstances, what he has to pay is not liability, but schar. Okay, so that's the basic answer. Break the Gemara now. If you're going to say that, ihachi. So this was the dialogue between Rav Yosef bar Chana and Rabbah. So that was Rabbah's answer. Says ihachi, says Rav Yosef bar Chana, Reisha diktani ein achrei Shabbos alav. He has a problem with this answer. Why? There's a reisha and a sefer to that brisa. The reisha is what we said before. The first part is what we said before, that a day worker does not get paid for Shabbos, therefore he doesn't work on Shabbos. And the sefer is where you're hiring him for the week or the month or longer, and he's getting paid sort of generally, and therefore he has an achrayus for all 7 days a week. So now that we're answering that this is all about the wage, ihachi reisha diktani ein achrayus Shabbos alav. The first part of the brisa, where we talk about a day worker, where the Gemara tells us that he doesn't work on Shabbos and therefore he's not liable for Shabbos. Hachanami lahafsed scharo. So, can you say that he doesn't lose a wage? Of course not. He's not making a wage. In other words, in the first part, you can't argue wages because there's no wage. So, of course, he's not losing a wage, right? Umi islay schar Shabbos, and is there really a schar for Shabbos? For Katani, a nosen lo schar Shabbos, right? That he wasn't paid for Shabbos. So if he's not paid for Shabbos, what is that ratio talking about? That therefore he's not obligated. That shomer, if something happens Shabbos, doesn't have to pay, right? So in the seifa, where we're talking about a weekly or monthly, then he is obligated to pay. Because how do you reconcile the Reisha and the Seifa? The Reisha and the Seifa have to be talking about the same thing. In a Brisa, you can't split it up and say the Reisha is speaking about one Inyan, the Seifa is speaking about another Inyan. So if you're going to say that in the Reisha, there's no question that he doesn't get paid schar for the day, because we're saying that he's a day worker. So the only thing about the Reisha is it has to be about liability. And we're saying he's not liable. Now, if he's not liable, then the way the Brisa works is the Reisha, if the Reisha and the Seifa are the same, there's no Chiddush. So the Chiddush is that in the Reisha, he's not liable, but in the Seifa, he's liable. What is he liable for? Schar? No, the Reisha is not talking about schar, so the Seifa can't talk about schar. Now, do you understand how all this is aligned? If the Reisha is talking only about liability and there's no liability, then the Seifa is also talking about liability. And we see that there is liability. You wanted to say that the reason why we reconcile this whole thing is because we're talking about he swears for his wage, not for liability. But from the nature of the Reisha and the Seifa, we see that he is swearing about liability, because the Reisha is not talking about schar, only liability. Therefore, in order to align the Reisha and the Seifa also has to talk about liability. And what does it say? Lefikach achrayus Shabbos alav. He has an achrayus Shabbos. So you see that he has to swear on liability. This is Rabbi Bachama's answer. It's a sort of dissecting Rabbah's answer and saying, Rabbah, you're telling me that the reason why it's no problem because the shvua is on schar, not on liability. But from the nature of the Reisha and the Seifa, that can't be, because in the Reisha there was never a discussion about schar, only liability. And in order to reconcile Reish and Seifa, we say they both have to be talking about liability. That's the chap here, because that's how it works. When you're dealing with a Bryce or a Mishnah, they have to align. You can't have the one of them talking about one issue, another talking about another issue. Otherwise, why are they lumped together in one section, one Mishnah or Brisa? So that's a Gevaldige Kasha, because if that's the case, we're talking about liability. So you see that there is liability for Shem Sacher, and that contradicts our Mishnah. So this is Rambam Bar Chama's question. So again, how do we look at this? So interesting ishtik. So Rabbah didn't have an answer. Rabbah was stymied, because Rambam Bar Chama asked him a very good question, and Rabbah didn't have an answer to the question. Omalei. So this is an interesting dialogue. Rabbah says to Rambam Bar Chama, Midi Shamalei Bahai. What do you know about this? Do you know something about this subject that you can enlighten me? Because Rabbah didn't have an answer. It was a very, very precise a question that he asked him. So he asked him, "Do you know anything?" So Rav Chama said, "Yehochem Rav Sheshes." So just understand that in the time of in these times, there were a couple of major incisors who were the sort of the Balei Halacha. So and not every one of the Tanoim or Amoraim were poskim, or in other words, they all contributed, but there were several who were the Rosh HaKol, as we call them. They were the head of the thing. So he said, and Rav Sheshes was one of them. So he says, I've heard from Rav Sheshes the following, that what B'Shekono Miyado, that again, we're introducing something in order to reconcile the problem. So on the face of it, we have a good stira. So Rav Sheshes has another theory, and this is the theory that will help us understand the dispute, if you were, between the Brisa and the Mishnah. What does it mean, B'Shekana B'Yado? It means that there was a commitment from the Poel to pay, even though he's not M'choyev. You hear this? In other words, he's hired, he gets a very nice wage, he's not responsible, but they have a side agreement. And the agreement is, I'm giving you the substantial wage, and you're going to be chayiv for liability. Right? We never thought about that. If on the surface of it there is no agreement, everything is normal, there clearly is no liability, there's no chiyuv for liability, because the Mishnah tells us there's no liability for hektish. But if they enter into a contract, you're allowed to enter into your own private contract and saying, okay, I understand that I'm not liable, but you're paying me a handsome wage, and I'm taking on an additional responsibility that I'll be liable for Gneva Aveda. Where does it say you can't do that? So comes Rav Sheshes, he says, that's what happened here. Is Mishakana Biyado, where they made an agreement that he would be chayiv for Gneva Aveda. So therefore, even though it's sort of contradictory to our Mishnah, but he's telling us a Gevaldige Chiddush that even though something is the norm, you can go outside of the norm and make an agreement. And if you see, and by the way, that's halacha. In other words, if you say, oh, Hashem Echinam is only responsible for Pshia, but nothing else. And so you make a deal with him and say, okay, you're Hashem Echinam, you're only responsible for Pshia, but again, it'd be harder with Hashem Echinam because he's not getting paid. But with Hashem Mesacha, let's just say where Hashem Mesacha does get paid, but he's exempt from let's say Oinus, and he says, if you pay me an extra $100 a week, I'll be chayiv for Oinus, which he normally wouldn't be.
But Rabbi, this is counter to the Torah. I mean, the Torah is supposed to exempt someone from being responsible in the case of hekdesh. So the contract, while legal, may be, is contrary to what the Torah intends here. So even though it's a binding contract, it undermines halacha. So how do you justify that?
So it's an interesting question, and you're right on one level because the Torah lays out for us that this is the roadmap, and when it comes to Shem Masachar, this I have to treat as Shem Masachar. The Torah leaves, there is a loophole. The Torah leaves open the possibility that even though al pi halacha you can't make him responsible, but a person can make himself responsible. He can take upon himself a responsibility under certain circumstances. The Torah never exempts or never closes the door to, unless it's a violation of something so egregious. But if two people have an agreement, and what are we talking about? We're talking about, yes, it's Hegdish, and he's not responsible for Hegdish. But if someone says, I want to take upon myself extra chamurim, yeah, why can we don't stop him? We don't stop him because there are times when, and we've seen this even without compensation, that someone took upon himself extra achrayas, extra chamurim, and we never say that a person can't take lefnim mishuras hadin, right? What does lefnim mishuras hadin mean? It means you go, this is the halacha, but you want to go beyond the halacha because you feel that you want to create an extra commitment on yourself to be a better person, so you want to have a greater achrayas. Torah never closes the door to that. So especially if it's a negotiated agreement, you'll pay me extra money, and which I need, and I'll commit that I'll be responsible. That is certainly an agreement that is not violative of the Torah, because the Torah doesn't speak to that.
I
So
hear you, Rabbi, but the thing that bothers me is somebody may see that and say, they paid him, not knowing the specifics of the contract, and they paid him to do this, but it's contrary to halacha. So aren't they worried about what they're
you're worried about Marasayan
in a lot of places? Why are they worried about Marasayan here?
Yeah, Marasayan, very good point. And that's something to think about, but I would normally say that Maris Ayin, in a general sense, Michael, works Lukula, not Lechumra. In other words, when you see something that smacks of how can they do that, it's because someone is weakening the halacha, even though there may be some loophole. That's when we worried about Maris Ayin. Maris Ayin the other way is generally not a problem, because if someone sees that, so what's he going to say? Oh, I'm chayiv even for oinis? No. Then he can realize, I'm not chayiv for oinis. This is the halacha. This fellow wanted to obligate himself for oinis, and therefore he got paid for it. I'm talking about Hashem Asachar. So we don't worry about Myers Ayin in that direction. We worry more about Lakula when you water it down and someone's not going to understand, because there's no sin. There's no sin in a chumrah, but there is a lav in a kula. In other words, there's a greater chance of you're violating something if you weaken it than if you strengthen it. But it's a good point, because we always want to keep an even keel, and people see things out of the ordinary, so they have to ask, why is this guy chayiv? The halacha is not like that. Oh, we got paid. That already makes it kosher. But how do you answer it when it's lakula? Because it technically isn't going to be an answer if it's watered down. So anyway, so that's the Gemara's answer, and the Gemara goes on to say v'cheinu Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan also says v'shekana miyado. So Rabbi Baruch Chama said, not only did I hear it from Rav Sheshis, who is an Amora, but also Rabbi Yochanan Eitana said the same thing, that when they had a deal. So if they had a deal, then we see that is already acceptable, and therefore there's not a problem with doing that. Okay, so again, an interesting Gemara, and what it does, it sort of solidifies what we've been saying all this time, that when they learned the Mishnah, there was all kinds of challenges to the Mishnah, and in each case, we had to sort of make a distinction why the challenge wasn't valid, because we were able to say that it was a slightly different circumstance. Okay, fine. So let's take a look here. Rashi. All right, so where are we on the Rashi? We're here. And the Omer Rabbi Lazar. No, that was last week. Okay, so we're at the Rashi in the third or a third of the very wide lines on the bottom. Hasoiches hapoyalim, gizba shel hektish shesocha poyalim mishel hegish, lishmor es hapara aduma shelekucha v'shomim oso shelo tifsol balias all b'mum. Those are the two major problems: is that a yoke or a blemish can passel the para aduma. Lishmor zatinokos shlo yitamu shehem megadlan osan lepara bechatzeros habenuyas bisloim. Right. So v'tachteyam cholol kidama b'secha behikshin tachas hamita. The fisha osu mala b'kayin hasoref. So they assist the kayin. Basically, they're assisting the kayin to burn the para aduma. So they have a role. She prisha b'tahara, and they have to be totally tahar. Ve'ein achav hakayinim noigim bo kol shiva, and in other words, even the kayin has to be separated from other kahanim. Kedamrina b'seder yuma tells us about the seder of Yom Kippur, that the certainly the Kohen Gadol had to be totally separate. The same here, this Kohen had to be separate. For Hatanoikas halalo shalo nitamu b'menachos. In other words, shalo nitamu me'olam mimleim mayim lemikdash. They bring the water to the mikdash. Chazon love kol shiva. In other words, again, it's a little bit more detailed as to what the role is, but the role is that these tinokos have a role, so they have to be guarded, that they shouldn't, without realizing it, become tameh. They wander off, and they come across a dead cat or whatever, so they can be metame. Okay, v'lishma hazroim sada mevcheres v'zrua la'omer, because they have to seed it for the omer, for the first barley on Pesach. Kodem Pesach, Shivim Yom, 70 days before Pesach is when they planted. Kedamrinan Menachos. Inami, or different theory, B'shvias Sfichim La'omer V'shtei Lechem, that it goes to the Omer and the Shtei Lechem. So, but in any event, those are someone is hired to actually guard so that there will not be a problem, and if it becomes either tameh or someone takes it, they won't have enough barley for the Beis Hamikdash. And Nesan schar Shabbos im sacha yom hu. If he's a day worker, he doesn't get schar lefikach, and a chayv Shabbos alav. Im ira behen kilkul b'Shabbos. If it's something happens on Shabbos, it gets destroyed. Ein chayv l'shalom. Schir Shabbos shavua. Schir shavua shmita shlema. Noisen loy schar Shabbos. Shenivlar b'schar. It's included in the schar shar hayamim ve'ena mefurish l'Shabbos. Again, that's the sort of the takana, is that you're not paying him for Shabbos, you're paying him for the greater service of a longer time. Shikana mido. Okay. All right. So basically, we understand the kasha and the teretz, and so we understand this section. Now, the last section, almost the last section of this Mishnah, if you remember, is that Reb Shimon at the end weighed in, and he made a distinction even among the four categories of where you don't have oino, or you don't have a responsibility. He says there's a chilik. What's the chilik? Says the Gemara. We'll go back to the Gemara. Says the Gemara as follows: Reb Shimon Omer, Kotshim Shechai Be'achri Yoson, Kachim, where there is a chiyuv, a responsibility, yesh lo ano. We'll see what that means in a minute. But when there's no liability to replace kachim, ein lahem ano, there's no ano. So that was Reb Shimon. So in other words, we've talked about this in the past as well, but just to repeat it, there's two ways that a person can dedicate a carbon. The first way, and it's all in the language, it's all in how he expresses it. If someone says hare olai, I have a responsibility to bring this carbon, then the responsibility falls on him. If there's a problem with the carbon, he has to replace it. Yes, he's giving it to the Beis Hamikdash, but he's committing that it's my responsibility. So the term Hari Olai means Kachim Shechai B'Achriyosim. That's what Reb Shimon means when he says Kachim that has a responsibility. It's the responsibility because you took the responsibility by saying Hari Olai. Therefore, Yechayev in Oinah. Why? Because even though it goes to Hegdish, but it's you as an individual. And that's how careful we have to be. You as an individual take responsibility, and you as an individual are chayiv and oinah. So that's a leap here, because after all, he's doing it for Hegdish. It's not for his own personal benefit. Says Reb Shimon, I draw a distinction. If I take the responsibility, even though it's Hegdish, I have to pay for oinah. And if I say harezu, not olai, harezu, this is the carbon, I didn't take personal responsibility. So if something happens to the animal, then I don't have an obligation to replace it, because I said harezu, this is a dedication to the. So it immediately becomes hegdish, and therefore hegdish is potem min oino. So we understand how that works. When you continue to bear responsibility to replace, even though it's going to Hegdish, it's technically yours, and therefore Oinor applies. But when you say Harizu, so you immediately give it over to Hegdish, it's no longer anything that you control. Therefore, if it becomes puzzle, tameh, or whatever, you're not mechuyev to replace it, and therefore it's the classic case of our Mishnah where anything to do with Hegdish, you're not mechuyev, because now you have sort of absolved yourself from any chiyuv by sort of letting go. Okay? So now, so that's the Mishnah. Okay? Now, we have a brisa that talks about Reb Shimon and his qualification of, what he's qualifying here, depending on Harizu, Hariolai. Tana kamed Rav Yitzchak bar Ava, a Tana came before Rav Yitzchak bar Ava, and he gave him, he wanted to talk Torah with him, so he told him the following: Kotshim shechai b'echrisun chayiv. If a person, so he makes this statement from Reb Shimon that repeats it, and he says that if someone who says, let's say, Hariolai, so he has an achrayis, then he has to shechai b'echrisun chayiv. He has to bear the responsibility, and he has to pay. So here we're getting into a little bit of an intricacy, because not only in this particular case do you have to repay, but you have to add the chomesh, the fifth, and you have to bring a carbon. And it's called, so depending on what, if it was stolen or something, then there's a different carbon called Oshem Gezela, and you have to give a carbon for the fact that it was stolen. So this is what he's telling this Chiddush. In fact, he's talking with Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, and he's telling him the following. Why? How do I learn this? So now, let me just get a chumash, because it's carefully taken from the words of the Torah in Vayikra when we talk about karbonos. So let's take a look at the words of the Torah. The Torah says, "Nafshi kisechata." if someone commits a sin, umol mal ba'Hashem, and he does meila. In other words, he does something keneged the Rabbanu Shalom. V'chichesh ba'amiso, right? And then the next words are that v'chichesh ba'amiso, he lies to his friend bipikadon. What does it mean he lies? Someone accused him of gazela or fraud or of anything like that, and he says, no, I didn't steal it. So we know that typically, if it has to do with hegdish, there's no shvua. If he has to do with a private person, there is a shvua. Now, he swore that he didn't do anything wrong, and then he comes back and he says, you know what? I have charata. I'm going to tell the truth that I committed this sin and I stole. So that's the setting of the pasuk at the end of Parshas Vayikra. So now, depending on how this is the juxtaposition of the words of the pasuk. Okay, so then let's go back. So it says, "Ani kore behen." He's telling Rabbi Yitzchak Ba'aba, this Tana, "Sh'ani kore behen b'Hashem v'chichesh." So how do I understand this pasuk? He reads it that I did a meila, I did something, I crossed the Rabbanu Shalom, v'chichesh, and I denied that I did it. So in other words, the meila, the what you did to Hashem is lying to your fellow man. That was the meila. In other words, you didn't directly do it to Hashem, but he's learning the pasuk Hashem v'chichesh, that you committed something terrible to Hashem. What is that you lied to your friend and you said that you didn't steal it or whatever it was. So that's pshat in the pasuk. V'she'ein chai b'yachrisin potter. The second, so he's trying to interpret Rav Shimon. That's what Rav Shimon means. Now, what's the flip side? The flip side is that if he's not chai b'yachrasim, why? Because he says harezu, then potter. Then he doesn't bear any chiyuv. He's not responsible, and he doesn't have to pay. But the Torah says he has to pay. So now he learns a different interpretation in the pasuk. Because if I take the words, and remember, the words of the pasuk are mol mal b'Hashem v'chichesh ba'amiso. So if you say b'Hashem v'chichesh, then you have affronted the Rabbanu Shalom. But if you read it mol mal b'Hashem, stop, v'chichesh ba'amiso, and he lies to his friend, then you're not confronting the Rabbanu Shalom anymore. Now it's only your friend. If it's your friend, then it has nothing to do with hegdish, has nothing to do. So that's why she'ein chayav b'achriyusan, because if he says harizu, it's strictly to the Rabbanu Shalom, right? if it's something against a private person, then of course there's responsibility. I'm responsible if I steal and then I come back and I say to you, I didn't steal, so you have to pay a penalty, you have to pay a chomesh. Right, you only kefel if you're caught, but if you come and are moda, then we make you pay just a chomesh, not kefel, and you have to give a carbon. So this is the interpretation of the Tana explaining Reb Shimon the whole thing is learned out from a pasuk, and it depends on how you juxtapose the words of the pasuk as to whether or not he's chayiv or not. Amalei, so Rabbi Yitzchak Ba'aba said to the Tana, he says, what do you mean? Klape layo. Depends on how you understand it. In other words, what's the seichel here? What is the seichel? Okay, Nun Chesam Beis, Ipcha Mistabra. I would think the opposite. You're telling me that this is the logic because there's a chiluk between between the first interpretation of the pasuk and the second interpretation of the pasuk. So if it's against the Rabbanu Shalom, then we say there is a chayav v'achruson, then you have to pay, then you pay. Otherwise, you don't. He says, I'm going to turn it around and say ipcha mistabra, that it's the other way around. What does that mean, the other way around? Where does a person have a, in other words, okay, so logically, where would you think a person has a greater responsibility to bring a carbon asham is when he has achrayus or doesn't have achrayus? Here, the Gemara is telling us that when he has the achrayus to the Rebbeinu Shalom, he doesn't bring a carbon. When he has achrayus to somebody else, then he brings a carbon. So Rabbi said that doesn't make any sense. It should be the other way around. That when you have an achrayus on a greater level, that's when you bring a carbon, not when you have an achrayus on a lesser level. So the carbon asham, again, now you have to look at the two sides of the coin. And he's saying that the logic doesn't hold the way you, the Tana, are presenting it to me in terms of Reb Shimon, because ipcha mistabra, I would think the other way right, the other way around. So that's one kasha. We're going to see it. We're going to go over that in Rashi in a minute. Okay, and there's a second thought to this is that we say that a shomer brings so we talk about a carbon if he swears falsely about the Rabbeinu Shalom, but not. In other words, it's not the same as the first, but you're exempting him. You're exempting him for lying about his chaver, but not for the Rebbeinu Shalom. So he should be chayiv for the Rebbeinu Shalom, but yet in our Mishnah we're saying you're not chayiv. In other words, the logic is that you should have a greater responsibility to the Rabbeinu Shalom than to somebody else, but yet the Mishnah tells us that when your responsibility is to the Rabbeinu Shalom, we give you a pass because you can't swear by Hegdish. So he's saying that this whole thing doesn't hang together. So let's take a look at Rashi. We'll have a better understanding. Ipcha mistabra, kol advorim nirim hepech. Everything seems to be the opposite. The Hashem ninhu, that when you're not chayiv b'achriyuson deals with the Rebbeinu Shalom tfei mishav chayiv b'achriyuson, more so than if you're chayiv b'achriyuson. The imbos l'chayvoy b'shel gavoa lepotro mishel hedyot. If we really wanted to make him chayiv b'shel gavoa, meaning when you're dealing with the Rebbeinu Shalom, and to pater when you're dealing with your fellow man, ken hoyelo lomer. It should have expressed that in so many in words. It should have said that. Kachim shechai b'achruson pater. That kachim shechai b'achruson you are pater. Sheni kore behem ba'amiso v'chichesh she'en chayiv b'achruson. In other words, the language of the Torah, remember we're saying that there's two ways of looking at this pasuk, and it depends on what words you pull together. If you pull together Mola Bashem v'chichesh, then it seems that the Me'ilah against the Rebbeinu Shalom is the lying. But if you say, no, the Me'ilah is something else, the lying against your fellow man is something else as well, then you have a different interpretation. He's saying that Shani Kora Behen Ba'amiso v'chichesh and chayiv b'achruson, that you're not chayiv b'achruson. Chayiv shani kora behem b'Hashem v'chichesh v'o dehedget havalei l'chiyuve tefei, that there should be a greater deal of responsibility when you're dealing with a hedyot, with your friend. The shomrei kachim potim min hashvua ubikol habo al yoda. In other words, because our Mishnah says that even though logic might dictate that when you're dealing with the Ribono Shel Olam, you should have a heightened level of chiyuv, the Mishnah says no. The Mishnah says we don't have a heightened level of chiyuv when you're dealing with the Ribono Shel Olam, you more so with your fellow man. In other words, it's as if the Ribono Shel Olam says, I'm mavata. I'm mavata on my covet. You don't have to give me responsibility. I don't have to be. You don't have to have bring a carbon and everything else. Rather, do it when you're dealing with your fellow man. So in other words, this is the kasha that the logic that you're telling me doesn't hold water. That's what he's telling the Tana. Omalei, so the Tana said to him, Ismaya. Okay, so again, he's saying, okay, if I didn't say it right, shall I just remove this whole theory from the Brisa? Omalei, so Rabbi Yisrael said to him, Lo. Don't just walk away and say that it doesn't make sense. Hachi ka'amar. So again, the Gemara is trying to reconcile and from this Tana that what he said did have an underlying merit, and Rabbi Yisrael Ba'ava is trying to explain it. He says, Hachi kama. This is what we mean. Kochim shechai be'achrisum chayev. If a shomer swears, he swears falsely about Kochim shechai be'achrayis, right? Then he has to bring a carbon. The Israbe, and why? Me B'Hashem v'chichesh. Why he has to bring a carbon is because we learn that the Me'ilah, the sin was against the Ribono Shel Olam, because the Ribono Shel Olam takes umbrage that you're stealing from your fellow man. But where someone swore about property that for which there is no achrayus, like we said before, the imat. Why? Because we exclude it min ba'amiso v'chichesh. Because we exclude it. Why? Because we excluded that he denied against his fellow man. In other words, so the chiyuv of Oshem Gezela is when you steal from the Ribono Shel Olam, but not from your fellow man. So that's how Rabbi Bar Chama wants to interpret what the Tana said. He said, no, you're not wrong. That if it's Chai B'Achruso, then you have to bring a carbon. What does it mean Chai B'Achruso? Because you take upon yourself to be responsible for the kachim. Therefore, when you deal in that circumstance, something happens to it and you're still mechuyev, then you have to bring a carbon asham gezela. But in a case where you don't take responsibility, say, I'm giving to Hegdish, I want to donate, but I don't want to have any further responsibility if something happens to it. So in that particular case, there is no chiyuv b'achriyusan. Says Rabbi Chama, then you have to learn the pasuk differently, because in that case, ba'amiso, it doesn't go ba'amiso that he v'chichesh, that he stole against the Ribono Shel Olam. We strictly make a division, and we say he stole against his fellow man, and when he steals against his fellow man, then there's no Oshem Gezela. Yeah, you have to pay and everything else, but there's no Oshem Gezela. So again, we see another example where the Gemara is showing us here that we're splitting a hair, we're splitting, in other words, in order to make the interpretation of the Tana correct, we have to sort of reinterpret what the Torah is telling us, and we juxtapose the words a little bit differently so that it does not come out to be a stira. Again, it's a lesson to us in terms of how we have to understand the Gemara, but then basically there's still no challenge to the Mishnah, because the Mishnah talks about where there is a full achrayus. Where there's a full achrayus, then you are responsible to the for the carbon, and to replace, and all those things that we talked about that are exempt and not exempt. But in the case where it's harizu, where he strictly takes a hands-off approach on being responsible, then we say that then he can be responsible and he has to pay whatever he has to pay, and it's not a steer to the Mishnah because the Mishnah is talking about a different circumstance. So we'll learn one more Rashi. Ismay, Oser Mishnah Zu Migersati, Hocha Kama, Hi Shani Kore Behen, Ba'Hashem V'Chichesh, Lo Mashma Ba'Hashem V'Chichesh, V'lo Ba'Amiso, L'Chayuva Mishun Shehein, Shel Hegdish, Ele Hochi Kama. It doesn't mean what you're saying. Kotshim Shechai B'Achriyuson, Kotshim that are Chai B'Achriyuson, Chayiv Carbon. Chayiv Carbon Shvua. In other words, if you are chayiv b'achriyusan because you took it upon yourself, then you're chayiv in a carbon. Fishehain shel amiso, because they still belong to the person. He hasn't let go of it because he made a personal commitment. Boss lepatro, and if he comes to patra himself, fishehain shel hegdish lahachi osabo v'chichesh. Therefore, we say lechichesh, and he lied. The rabuye af im yesh bahen tzad gavoa. Then we include it and say that it's an affront to the Rabbanu Shalom because you're dealing with a carbon to Hashem. So Shen Chaim v'chrusun potter v'shani kora behen lematen, to exclude it ba'amiso v'chichesh v'hochaleka amiso. And here there isn't, when you're dealing with a carbon the Rabban Shalom, there's no amisa, there's no friend, right? You deal strictly with the Rabban Shalom. So again, it's subtle in the words of the pasuk as to how you interpret it, but at the end of the day, there's a legitimacy, and that's what Rambam Chacham is telling to the Tana, is that no, he said to him, shall I remove my svara from the Gemara entirely? So he's saying, no, don't remove your svara, because we can reinterpret what you said to understand that that there's one set of rules when you're dealing with the Rabban Shalom. In other words, when you have a chrayas to the Rabban Shalom, there's one rule. And when you don't have a chrayas, then you're not dealing with the Rabban Shalom anymore. You're only dealing with Amiso, with your friend, and therefore there's no carbon, because the carbon, Hashem Gezela, refers only to the Rabban Shalom. Anyway, it's an interesting interpretation, because once again, it's consistent with what we've been saying, is that there should be no stira, there should be no contradictions between the Mishnah and the Brisa and other, he comes together with a Chiddush and wants to slug up the Mishnah. So we're steadfast in the Mishnah, even according to Reb Shimon, who wants to make a chilek between Yesh Ber Machrayis Ve'en Ber Machrayis. It's a very clear distinction. And when there is a Chrayis, he's saying it's not a stira to our Mishnah. We still can say in the Mishnah that Hegdish, there is no Achrayis. But when you didn't give up Achrayis, then you're personally responsible. So if you gave up achrayas, that's the Mishnah talking about. You give up achrayas, you have no responsibility. But if you didn't give up achrayas, because you said hari alai, then you're still responsible. So you have to replace it. You have to bring the carbon asham, and you're chayiv and oinoah, because it doesn't fit into what the Mishnah is telling us. The Mishnah is talking about ein, but where there is no achrayas. When you have an achrayas, Reb Shimon says you're in a different stratosphere. You've now put yourself. And Michael, to your point, it's kind of like the chumrah that we said before. In the other case, is that if a person took upon himself and that he's going to be chayiv on something he normally isn't chayiv for, we don't block him. I mean, he's getting paid for it. We don't block him. So you see that even though the Torah tells us this is the direction, but there's no chiyuv, there's no harm if you have a chumrah that you put upon yourself, and hari olai is a chumrah. If a person is hari, he doesn't have to say hari olai. He can say hari zu, and it's a perfectly fine carbon. But by saying hari olai, he's taking upon himself an extra chumrah, and for the extra chumrah, the Mishnah's the Mishnah doesn't directly apply that he doesn't have to pay because he took upon himself an extra chumrah. All right, so we'll stop here, and next week we'll